It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet town. Ruth sat on the old wooden bench outside the diner, her favorite place to sit when the weather was nice. She was 76, with silver hair tucked neatly under a soft woolen scarf, and though the years had worn her body thin, her spirit had always remained strong. A woman of few words, Ruth had learned to navigate life's hurdles without much sound. She had been deaf since birth, but she had never let it hold her back. In fact, it often made her more observant of the world around her. Her ability to read lips and gauge emotions through the slightest changes in body language was a gift she had long perfected. She was enjoying her lunch, a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the cool air. Ruth always felt at peace here, in the little corner of the diner where she could watch people come and go. She loved the rhythm of the place, the clink of coffee cups, the murmur of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a comfort, something familiar in a world that often felt too loud in other ways. But today, her quiet peace was shattered. A group of teenagers, no older than 16 or 17, appeared at the entrance of the diner. They were laughing and talking loudly, walking with a swagger that suggested they owned the street. Ruth noticed them immediately, but her attention was drawn to something far more important, the sandwich in her hands. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching, but she felt them, a change in the air. One of the boys, with a mop of messy blonde hair, sauntered over to her. He stood directly in her line of sight, and for a moment, Ruth didn't understand what he wanted. She looked up at him with a polite smile, raising her hand to her ear, as she always did when someone tried to speak to her. But the boy wasn't speaking. Instead, he began to mock her gestures, moving his hands in exaggerated motions, trying to imitate the way Ruth communicated. His friends, standing a few paces behind him, burst out laughing, and Ruth's heart dropped into her stomach. She had dealt with ridicule all her life, but this was different. This was cruel. Confused but trying to remain composed, Ruth lowered her hands and turned back to her sandwich. She hoped they would go away, that they would leave her in peace. But that was not their intention. One of the girls in the group, a tall brunette with a sneer on her face, snatched the sandwich from Ruth's hands and tossed it onto the ground. The group erupted into more laughter, their voices sharp and mean. Ruth froze, her hands shook, and her eyes darted from the sandwich to the faces of the teens, each one of them smiling wickedly. She couldn't hear their laughter, but she could see it in their eyes, the satisfaction of someone too powerful to be stopped. Ruth stood up slowly, trying to gather herself, but her old legs trembled. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. Before she could regain her balance, the boy with the messy hair pushed her back down onto the bench. The force wasn't hard, but it was enough to knock the wind from her chest. The entire time, they filmed her, capturing the moment on their phones as she sat there, confused and humiliated. Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, trying to hold her dignity. But inside, something had shifted. The world that had always been quiet now felt unbearably loud, filled with laughter and mockery. Ruth's world, once calm and peaceful, had been invaded by their cruelty, and she didn't know how to fight back. But then, in the distance, there was a new sound, a rumble, like thunder approaching. It was deep, vibrating the air, and for the first time that day, Ruth's ears caught the sound of something different, something powerful. The rumble of engines grew louder, echoing through the town's quiet streets like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Ruth's attention, though still fixed on the teens who were laughing and jeering, was suddenly drawn to the approaching noise. She didn't know what it was at first, just a low, vibrating hum that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. But the bullies didn't notice. They were too busy filming their victory, their cruelty bubbling over in cruel chuckles and insults. Ruth wiped the tears from her cheeks, feeling the sting of humiliation in her chest. She glanced around, wishing someone would help, but the street was still empty except for the few passers-by who seemed to avoid the scene. No one stepped in, no one stood up. It was as though the world had decided to turn a blind eye to her pain. And then, the sound grew closer, unmistakable now, a series of motorcycles roaring down the road. Ruth couldn't see them yet, but she could feel the weight of the approaching presence, like something big was coming. The group of teens, too absorbed in their mockery, didn't even look up. They were too wrapped up in their own world to notice the change in the air. But Ruth felt it, like the air before a storm, charged with something different. A single motorcycle appeared first, the rider dressed in leather, his silhouette cutting through the fading sunlight. The bike rumbled with a power that made the pavement tremble, a sound that was different from the usual hum of traffic, more primal, more intense. Ruth looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the rider's face, a man with sharp features, dark sunglasses, and a determined look. But it wasn't just one bike. As if in response to an unspoken signal, a line of motorcycles appeared behind him, a full pack of riders with their engines growling in unison. The roar of their arrival was enough to stop the laughter in its tracks. The bullies turned slowly, startled by the sound. They were still standing in front of Ruth, their phones still in hand, but now their attention was divided. The leader of the group, a tall teenager with a red baseball cap, squinted toward the motorcycles, his smug smile faltering as he saw the bikers approaching. Jacob, the leader of the pack, pulled up in front of the diner, his motorcycle cutting through the parking lot with ease. The rumble of his bike's engine seemed to shake the very air, and for a moment, the whole street felt still. It was a jarring contrast to the bullies' laughter, the weight of the bikers' presence suddenly undeniable. Jacob dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a deliberate thud that echoed off the diner's walls. He stood tall, his broad shoulders visible even under the heavy leather vest he wore. His face was unreadable, a tough exterior hardened by years of life on the road. But there was something different about him today. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the scene quickly, taking in the situation. One of the younger bikers, a woman with a fiery red bandana, hopped off her bike with the grace of someone used to confrontation. She stood beside Jacob, her posture unrelenting, her eyes scanning the group of teens. Jacob didn't say a word at first. He simply looked at the teenagers, his gaze like a thundercloud about to burst. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. Slowly, the teens started to shift, unease creeping into their expressions as they realized they weren't dealing with just anyone. These weren't some random strangers, they were bikers, people who lived by their own rules, whose presence could demand respect. The leader of the bullies, unsure of how to handle this, straightened his back and gave a nervous chuckle. "What do you want?" he asked, though his voice lacked the earlier confidence. Jacob's response was simple. He pointed to the phone in the leader's hand. "Delete it," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. The teens froze, unsure of how to react. It was as though they'd been caught in the middle of a moment they didn't understand, a moment that was about to change everything. The power had shifted, and Ruth, still seated on the bench, looked up at the bikers with a mixture of hope and confusion. She couldn't hear their voices, but the threat in Jacob's eyes spoke louder than anything she had heard all day. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of silence that precedes a thunderstorm. The bullies, once so full of bravado, now stood frozen, their phones clutched tightly in trembling hands. The leader, still unsure of the sudden shift in power, stared at Jacob, his bravado cracking under the weight of the bikers' presence. Jacob didn't say anything more, but his posture, strong and unmoving, made it clear he wasn't going anywhere until his demand was met. The leader swallowed hard, glancing nervously at his friends. They, too, were uncertain now. The girl with the messy hair, the one who had thrown Ruth's sandwich on the ground, nervously tapped her phone, her confidence evaporating in the face of the bikers. She exchanged looks with the others, but no one spoke. Finally, the leader of the group, his hand shaking slightly, lowered his phone. He looked at Jacob, then back at his friends, who all seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the leader navigated to the video they had filmed of Ruth, her distress captured in heartbreaking clarity. The boy's thumb hovered over the delete button, and for a long moment, it seemed as though he might back down. But Jacob's gaze never wavered, and the weight of his presence loomed over the entire scene. With a trembling hand, the bully pressed delete. The sound of the video disappearing from the phone's screen was almost louder than the silence that followed. The bully dropped his phone to his side, and his expression turned from defiance to embarrassment. The rest of the group stood motionless, the reality of the situation settling in. Jacob didn't take his eyes off them as they stood there, the silence stretching on until it was almost unbearable. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm. "You think it's funny, mocking someone who can't fight back? You ever stop to think about what it might feel like to be her?" He nodded toward Ruth, who sat quietly, still wiping away the remnants of her tears. "You've got the power to hurt people with your words. But one day, you'll understand what it means to be on the other side." None of the bullies spoke. Their heads were down, their eyes avoiding his gaze. Ruth couldn't hear the words, but she could see them. the way their shoulders slumped, the way they fidgeted, their hands now empty of phones. They were no longer laughing. In fact, they looked like they had seen a side of the world they hadn't known existed. Jacob stepped toward Ruth, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement, and he reached a hand down to her. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her face a mixture of confusion and relief. The bikers, standing in a quiet line behind Jacob, waited patiently, giving her space. Ruth hesitated for just a moment, her fingers still trembling. Then, she placed her hand in his. "You all right, ma'am?" Jacob asked gently. Ruth couldn't hear his words, but she saw the kindness in his eyes, the sincerity in his posture. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the strange warmth of being seen, not as a target, but as a person. She nodded slowly, the tears still fresh but now mixing with a faint smile. She wasn't sure what to say, but somehow, his presence made her feel safe. The group of bikers didn't stick around much longer. Jacob, after making sure the bullies had learned their lesson, gave a subtle nod to the others. Without a word, they mounted their bikes, the engines coming to life in a synchronized roar. The noise was like a cleansing storm, washing away the remnants of the cruelty that had just occurred. As the bikers began to pull away, the rumble of their motorcycles fading into the distance, Ruth remained on the bench. She watched them go, the sound of their engines slowly fading until it was nothing more than a distant memory. She looked at the ground where her sandwich had once been, the crumbs scattered, but somehow, it didn't seem as important anymore. What mattered was that, for once, the bullies had learned a lesson. And Ruth had found an unexpected sense of peace. The world wasn't always kind, but there were moments, just fleeting moments, when people stepped in, when the silence was broken by something bigger than the cruelty. Today had been one of those moments.